Welcome to our panel, Experiencing Change, Enduring Struggle. My name is Mohammed. I'm a Senior Program Officer at the Resiliency Institute. Today we're going to talk about the second of our two studies. The first one was conducted in 2020 before COVID. This one, we collected the data in the middle of COVID because arguably we're not necessarily it's not a post-COVID world necessarily. My fellow, introducing you to my fellow panelists and my dear friends, in so many ways. Gillian Gonda is communications and program strategist working with mission-oriented organizations. Organizations interested in a more loving and restorative work through program design, meaningful research, communication strategy, deep engagement, collective practice, and storytelling. Gillian has worked her entire career in the nonprofit sector, in public media and philanthropy, doing communications, program strategy, community outreach, and public engagement. As co-author of the Fletcher Institute's Spiritual Study, What Does Spirituality Mean to Us? Gonda has brought significant and thoughtful conversations about the changing landscape of spiritual identity and the nuance of spiritual experience to scholars, practitioners, and everyday folk. The study that I mentioned, we have copies of that here in front of me, so you can grab yourself a copy on your way out or during the panel. It is my honor to introduce you to Dr. Pamela Esteban King, Executive Director of Thrive Center for Human Development, Fuller Theological Seminary. As the Peter L. Benson Professor of Applied Developmental Science and Executive Director of the Thrive Center for Human Development, Dr. King's academic and applied efforts aim to promote a movement of human thriving that contributes to flourishing societies. Her primary research interests lie at the intersection of thriving and spiritual development. She's passionate about understanding what individual strengths and environments enable diverse humans to grow individually, relationally, and aspirationally. She holds a particular interest in understanding the role of faith, spirituality, religion, and virtue in this process. She has played a central leadership role in building an empirical field of study of religious and spiritual development within developmental psychology that provides a psychological science perspective of spiritual formation. Her work combines theology, empirical research, and community engagement to further understand what context and settings to enable people to thrive for the greater good. And also, it's my honor to introduce Mohammed Williams, one of the few visual sociologists of religion I know. He and I met years back, and I was fascinated by his work, particularly his use of the photo voice method. He's expert in visual sociology, and at the time when I met him, he was also executive director of a community of researchers called the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. Thank you. I want to start with, C.S. Lewis, the British author. And not only was he an author, he was also a lay theologian. He says something about the moments that reflect on the moments particularly the COVID-19 experience we've all endured. He says something about evil and suffering. He said, we can ignore even pleasure. Pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. I'm not trying to, this is from his book, The Problem of Pain. I'm not sure, trying to draw a comparison between what he's talking about and this particular moment, and particularly connecting to people. But we endured a very unique experience in human history. There were a few, like the plague, the Great Plague, the 1918, there was another COVID-like experience in 1918, which also has a connection to our organization. The founder of our organization, John Fetzer, who was one of the victims of the 1918 pandemic. And he survived, and then he made a commitment to do God's work because of it. So it has a connection to this moment that we're trying to present to you. Very interesting thing in our study this time was the fact that people were praying a lot during the pandemic. This was also confirmed by another study by other people. People were praying. To pray has different meanings in different traditions in Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Arabic, others. Basically, it's more dialogic. People seeking or speaking to God or asking for help. So I think that's probably what happened during the pandemic. Gillian will tell you about that. Some of the things we've done in our studies. As I said, we did, this is the second one. We did the first one in 2020. Our goal is not to, we're not a research organization or an academic institution. Our goal was not to trace trends and what's happening in the religion and spirituality space. We did our research for a purpose to do our job better because we have a spiritual mission. But at the same time, we did not want to ignore the fact that our research has to be rigorous. So we reached out to research organizations like Gallup, NORC, and so forth, and make sure that an academic process is incorporated into the process. And we have the data is available to scholars who are interested to do more research. So far, I think we encouraged scholars and gave them some support to write papers and publish them in peer-reviewed journals. We have done about 5 based on our data. So we made sure, even though we did the research to meet our goals, organizational goals, we made sure that the studies are rigorous and meet academic standards. And as you can see, we also work with academics. That's the genesis of our project and the process. We also try to use some, Gillian will tell you about the methods we use. We try to not just focus on just a survey or a study, but also use techniques that will help us capture some of the spiritual experiences. Spiritual experiences are ineffable. They're not easy to describe. Maybe someday in the future, when we have the right technology, maybe with AI and other things, we'll be able to capture spiritual experiences. But we have taken some risks. We have come up with some innovative methods to get some nuanced data about spiritual experiences. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Gillian. She will talk about the research overall and some key findings. And Dr. King will talk about how she used AI to analyze the data. And Roman will talk about his visual analysis of images we captured for our study. So thank you. Gillian?
Thank you, Mohammed. Welcome, everyone. We do have some interactive opportunities today, so that's why we're encouraging people, if you came in late, we do have some paper and materials in the first few rows, so at some point, maybe those of you that are nicely situated in the back can move up. I'm Gillian. It's been such a pleasure the last, was it been now, Mohammed, about 5 years since we conceptualized this research for the Fetzer Institute. The Institute's mission to help build a spiritual foundation for a loving world begs a bigger question: what is a spiritual foundation? And we realized that it would take some time for us to really understand what the state of spirituality is in America today. So conceptualized our first research well before the pandemic. However, research was gathered, I just want to say, in 2020, in January and February is when the survey was fielded. We did our qualitative research, focus groups, and in-depth interviews in late 2019. We had no idea in January and February when we were fielding the research what was upon us. And we were very excited. We were not excited about the pandemic, but very pleased that we have what researchers call clean data. None of this was gathered when people were actually quarantined and at home. But we had a challenge of them releasing this research during the pandemic, that block of time. So what we did in 2020, as Mohammed said, we set out with two big questions. How do people understand and experience spirituality for themselves? And how does their spirituality relate to the way they engage with others and their community? At the time, and continuing for the Fetzer Institute, has been an interest in democracy and in the breakdown of dialogue and the polarization that had been happening. So we incorporated a number of questions that look at how do people civically engage with their community and the world around them. And those questions remained in the 2022 study. So during the pandemic, what was really fascinating is we launched this in about October of 2020. And as we were releasing it, one of the big questions from the media and from others was, well, how would people answer these questions right now during the pandemic? What would they say about their spiritual lives? So early on, it planted the seed when we were launching the first study. What would it look like to ask these questions again? So we were able to refield this in 2022, asking for the most part the same questions. How do people understand and experience spirituality? How does their spirituality relate to the ways they engage with their community? Plus, what happened? How did spiritual practices and experiences change and or support people during the pandemic? Today we'll focus primarily on the question of how do people describe and live their spiritual lives, as well as touching on how did spiritual practices and experiences change. There'll be a little bit in there about how they connected with their community, but we're not going to spend significant time on that today. Just a moment about just a few minutes on the research process and design. Similar to our 2020 study, we partnered with the University of Chicago Newark National Opinion Research Center. They're up there with the Pews and Gallups of the world and have a panel that they reach out to. This is a national representative survey. Over 3,600 Americans were surveyed in November and December of 2022. This time, based on our experience with drawing what spirituality means to you, we'll hear more about that from Roman, and hopefully you can participate in this today. We had half of our respondents draw at the very beginning of the survey. They were asked to draw what spirituality means to them, and we have some interesting findings as a result of that. I'm going to read some quotes. Everything felt more distant, not just in relation to spiritual religious life, but I felt more isolated in all aspects of my life, my faith included. This comes from a 27-year-old female, slightly spiritual, moderately religious Christian.
I developed a stronger pessimism about life and the world. Still spiritual, but lost my chronically optimistic views. Male, 45, very spiritual, not at all religious.
Because we were all forced to spend more time alone, I felt much more introspective during this time, losing both of my parents, my only blood relatives, and them being important guiding lights in my life. It has brought up numerous questions of a spiritual nature that I will be delving into, trying to understand and hopefully answer over the rest of my lifetime. So 63-year-old female, very spiritual, not at all religious, Native American.
Okay, now we have a little activity for you. Turn to your neighbor and talk about in what ways your religious and or spiritual life change as a result of the pandemic. Where did you lean in, or did you disconnect? Two more minutes. We have another engaging activity for you, so I'll hand you over to Gillian again.
You know, that's not nearly enough time to delve into how your spiritual religious life changed. We imagine that you shared some stories of challenge, but of opportunity. Here's another few quotes. I went through a depression and found understanding in my spirituality and connection to God. This is a 20-year-old Hindu female, very spiritual, moderately religious.
I'm a lot more focused on how this life will end and what it all means. Male, 44, very spiritual, moderately religious, Catholic.
I joined more faith-sharing groups via Zoom, which enriched my spiritual life. I had more time to call and interact with family and friends, more via phone and Zoom, which also enriched my spirituality. 67-year-old Catholic female, moderately spiritual, moderately religious. What we found overall through these quotes was, and this is a gross simplification in the sense, but either there was a disconnection, people that really just pulled back from life, depression, anxiety set in, a sense of isolation, and we saw many of this in some of these open-ended quotes, a loss of faith in humanity. On the other hand, we heard a lot about people leaning in, feeling they had an opportunity to have a closer relationship to God. There was some sense of deepening or shifting in their spirituality, a focus on values. This showed up quite a bit, spending more time in nature. So just to step back from what we learned from the pandemic, if you remember the very reason for this research, and this is true of both the 2020 and the 2022 research, was to understand more about how people think and talk about their spiritual lives. So one of our questions in the survey was, what comes to mind when you hear the word spirituality? We have a little opportunity here to see what this room thinks. So if you have a smartphone, it should be very simple. Even a few of you do this, it'll be interesting to see. You can either scan the QR code there, or join at slido.com and enter in that number. Go ahead and answer that question. What comes to mind when you hear the word spirituality in 1 to 3 words? Wow, 15. Good job, everyone. Fascinating. Those divine, deep connection, these are the words that multiple people entered. So they, as in this word cloud technology is great, it shows up bigger. But we see wholeness, interconnectivity, depth, peace, heart, beliefs, feeling of sacredness, oneness with creation, pervasive energy, all pervasive energy. Wonderful, thank you. Thank you so much everyone for sharing. This is some of what materialized, again, the larger words representing more answers from our survey respondents in this open-ended question. Belief, power, higher power, God, religion, spirit, life, faith, peace. Here are some further quotes from our research. Spirituality is a connection to something beyond yourself, maybe a concept or belief, usually that can't be inherently observed or proven, but that you hang on to because it makes you feel something. 18-year-old female, slightly spiritual, not at all religious, she's agnostic.
Not being so caught up in the material world, being able to understand that there is more to life. Male, 28, very spiritual, slightly religious.
I feel like it is getting in touch with an inner peace, a higher power than everyone in your life. 66-year-old female, moderately spiritual, moderately religious, Unitarian.
A sense of something more than self, a binding force, a search for our source, a seeking for a truth better than the truth of men, an instinctive understanding that there is more despite science's current tools and ability to locate that ultimate truth. Male, 60, very spiritual, very religious.
So are a lot of verbal or written descriptions of what spirituality means to you. When we launched this research, as I said, in 2020, we had a fairly robust qualitative stage. We did in-depth interviews and we did a number of focus groups around the country. And as an icebreaker, ostensibly, that's what it started out to be. Like, well, how do we get people into this conversation? We had people draw what spirituality meant to them. And it was astounding how that shifted the conversation and what that opened up for people when they could just draw what spirituality meant to them. We replicated that in the 2022 survey using just the interface of the computer. So an tablet or their desktop computer. There's a few of these. This is simply a light, the sun. This is one of my favorite drawings from this new round of research. He's saying, I don't know who watches over us, but I hope they are proud of us. We have one final definition that is offered. Spirituality is often described as an individual's personal and subjective relationship with a higher power, a sense of something greater than oneself, or a transcendent dimension of existence. It can involve a search for meaning and purpose in life, the cultivation of inner peace and well-being, and a desire for connection with others and around the world around us. Well, this comes from ChatGPT, 9 months old now. And when asked about their personal beliefs, stated that they do not hold personal beliefs or experiences. Just to get another read of the room really quickly, if you can go back to that same slide, we want to get a sense of how spiritual and religious this room is. Not surprising. All right, we're going to move. How religious are you? I like how this business is really fun. Interesting. Great. Thank you so much. So I'd say we're a spiritual religious group, wouldn't you? It's that way. To just get into we want to move on to some of the more in-depth analysis that both Pam and Romy were able to do for us, but just to give you a sense of what we learned in our second fielding in this remained pretty consistent with the 2020 data. The majority of people in the United States consider themselves both spiritual and religious. In spite of, and though this is a very important trend to see the change shifts for those that you may hear as more spiritual but not religious, 12% are neither and 4% are religious only. Since 2020, and this really falls across a number of measures around spirituality, there was a slight decline in the extent of one's spirituality, but these numbers remain fairly consistent. 84% of Americans are spiritual to some degree. 70% of Americans are religious to some degree. As I said, the extent of spirituality and religion declines somewhat. And those declines seem to be among some of the youngest and oldest Americans' generation. In terms of our spiritual practices and activities, 87% of Americans engage in at least one spiritual or religious activity at least once a week. The most prominent practices include prayer, art, and that's engaging with creative visual art as well as music, reading, being in nature, and yoga. These activities were engaged in weekly or more. And 80% of Americans have a spiritual experience most days. This looks like feeling thankful for your blessings. Having gratitude is the most common spiritual experience. Feeling touched by the beauty of creation, over 50%. Asking for help from a higher power, or desiring to be closer to a higher power, are all near 50% of Americans. So what comes to mind when you hear the word spirituality? We ask people to draw their response, and I'm going to turn it over to Roman to talk more about these drawings. Okay.
Thank you, Gillian. You notice around the room that there is paper and either a pencil or a pen or marker. If there isn't one near you, please move forward a little bit to find one. And I want to spend the next couple of minutes, about 2 minutes. I'd like you to respond to this prompt. I'd like you to draw what comes to mind when you hear the word spirituality. Okay, we're about halfway through your time to draw. This will just be a rough draft of your masterpiece. So, and you can take it home. Another 30 seconds or so to finish up. Okay, as you put those final touches on your drawing of spirituality, I would like you to turn to someone nearby, show them your picture if you are so brave, and tell them about what you drew. All right, you have to switch partners. Go ahead and switch. All right, another few seconds to remind them of conversations. All right, friends. As we mentioned earlier, there are 3 steps at the beginning of the survey. So about half of the people were asked to draw, and we ended up with a little over 1,700 drawings this way. Most of them drew with their desktop computers, some of them were on phones, very few people used tablet devices. And then those people who drew, they're asked the second question, to describe that quote or that drawing. And here you see an example of someone's drawing, and then their description comes from within and then continues in all directions. And then there's a third piece at the beginning of the survey that said to define spirituality. And that third question that you're seeing here was asked not only of people that draw, but also those who didn't. And that gave us the ability then to compare these different definitions of spirituality, in part to see if there were any differences. What happens when you start a survey and ask someone to draw spirituality? What does it look like for them versus the control group that didn't draw? But I'm going to focus most of my time just kind of unpacking some of the pictures and telling you just sort of the shape of those data. I'm a visual sociologist, which means that most of my work focuses in on images of some sort, something that's drawn, photographs that are taken. So what did the respondents draw? Well, interestingly, 46% of drawings incorporated some kind of a symbol. This is an example, this female, 71 years old, spiritual non-religious. And we saw a lot of these different kinds of symbols. 37% of the drawings were only symbols. Now, at first I kind of wondered, is that because people really didn't like the drawing bit? They're just like, ooh, well, anybody can draw a cross pretty easily with a cursor. Maybe that's why they use the process. I'm not sure, to be honest. Think about it from your own perspective. Did you enjoy the act of drawing? Maybe it's something this crowd would enjoy and another didn't. 36% of people drew words. Anybody? I'm curious. Anybody have a symbol? Go ahead. Words first. Words. There's at least one person. How about anybody draw a symbol? Couple. Yeah, a few. Check this out. About a quarter of people only use words. When you look at those words, 54% of the words were religious words. Remember, we asked them to draw spirituality. This doesn't, if they had put some decoration in words, maybe it would count as a drawing. I honestly, as a social scientist, it's really curious, but the only way to really get to the bottom of it would be to spend some time with these people and ask them, how do you do this? And we don't have the luxury of those conversations. 74% of the symbols were religious. Draw spirituality, you get a bunch of peace symbols. Okay, there were some of those, but it was like 2%, 1%. 67% of the symbols were religious. 19% of the drawings had something to do with nature. And maybe they incorporated a symbol or a word or a few words. Sometimes the words were used as labels, which kind of makes sense because I don't know about you, I'm not good with drawing on my cursor, and labels would have been helpful if I was doing this exercise. 14% of drawings include humans or spirit beings. Some of my favorite spirit beings I had to really fight myself. It's not really representative of this set of drawings. 24 or 25 of the drawings, they look like those little ghosts from Pac-Man. And in fact, but you can imagine a little Pac-Man ghost, but one of them, faintly in the corner, there's a little sun. Look at it. Oh, that's a sun. This is about nature. And there's a ghost. The sun is shaped like Mr. Pac-Man, like that little. Really hard. 8% of the drawings. 12% incorporate incorporate light. And I'm thinking about light here both as like light from the sun and invisible light as in like an aura. When I first saw this picture, I thought, finally, we have a Muslim drawing a picture. I thought for sure this is a depiction of someone on their prayer rug. The beard, the head, all of that. Turns out, when you read their description, this is Jesus riding the clouds in heaven. But here's my point. The visual data only goes so far. Right? This old phrase that a picture's worth 1,000 words, it's not true. It's actually only worth about 5 on average when you look at our data. And the picture is really only worth 1,000 words if we interact about it, if we have a conversation about it. And I wonder what the difference was for you when you word clouded your 2 or 3 words and when you drew. And I invite you to reflect on maybe those differences as you think about these data. 4% of our drawings included auras, and I thought those little squiggly lines were auras. Okay, this is Jesus the Son. 11% of the drawings were abstract. And when you add all this up, you're going to be saying some numbers here, but let's put this in the context. 72% of the drawings were either only symbols, only words, or only some abstraction that you could not really figure out looking at it. 28% were what we might call as proper drawings. It says something about the process. It says something about how people imagine spirituality. It also says something about how hard it is to represent things. We gave them a hard assignment. This is how they responded. So, how did they define spirituality? They drew first. Well, to get to the bottom of this, I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, so I'll just say this. We kind of went through the data with different colored highlighters. And each of those colored highlighters are one of these words. The afterlife, community. Was it monotheistic? Did it have to do with nature? Was it religion? So let's say spirituality is something that's not religion. Or was it really about organized religion, another deity that passed itself, so on and so forth? Did it have to do with some activity that they're involved in? Was it something that seemed really cognitive, up in their heads? And so we went through and basically highlighted those. Then we can push a button on our data analysis software to bring that together and to crunch the numbers. So we turn those highlights into numbers, and we can do statistical analysis. So, what difference did drawing make? It turns out, if someone drew first, they were more likely, in their definition, to talk about community, nature. They were much more likely to have something that was emotional in their definition, and something that had to do with ethics. Now, oftentimes that came in around like a golden rule kind of thing, or maybe even platinum rule in a couple of cases. Here's what that looked like. So someone who draws really a very elaborate picture, right? All kinds of stuff happening. And then go on to with a description. Remember, they went to description next. I'm a Christian, but I'm not particularly religious. I tend to practice my spirituality from nature and relationships I build with people and people around me. That feeling you get of lightness in your chest when you've done something good, or someone has shown you love by something good for you. To me, that's the case. So that's the definition, rather than description. There's some loss, though, right? When they went from that description to what they defined there. Our relationship as humans with the world around us and others. It's a little more packaged. But that's the progression that we saw. And so in there you see these themes of community, of nature, of ethic, and also turns out, well, I'll skip the numbers here and see we're going to be time. But these findings are statistically significant. I'll just say that much. And then you're less likely to mention organized religion, another deity, or transcendence if you drew a picture before you define spirituality. Again, another example, and forgive me because I have to deal with many friends from California. And I'll leave you with this. So just earlier we talked about so what, right? So what if someone draws spirituality and then defines it, and it turns out to do something? Well, part of the study looked at art and nature and these other things as practices. So drawing, photography, art practices taps into a different side. And it can actually draw out parts of an experience that you're not totally aware of, or maybe not cognizant of in the moment, that can surface and really be beneficial. Okay, next is Dr. King. She will talk about AI and how we use AI in our research.
Thank you. Yes, you just wanted photos, and I'm going to take you deep into the weeds of semantic analysis. If you weren't already sleeping at this point, try to spice that up. I had the privilege of working with one of my colleagues, Dr. Kim, who is in South Korea, not with us today, in our analysis of short answers of two specific questions that was asked on. One was asked on both rounds of analysis in 2020 and the other only in the 2022. Sung and I were so grateful to be able to work with this extraordinary data set that represents so many different people across the US. It was gathered in such a rigorous manner in New York, so we're very grateful to that, sir. So enjoyed being able to keep on this project. So yes, AI is a bit all the rage. I am fortunate that my colleague Sung Kim has become quite an acclaimed expert in different forms of semantic analysis, chat, etc. We applied something called structural topic modeling to, in the first case, about 7,000 responses, and in the second case, to about 3,500 responses. Now, I am an unusual person, and I am a faculty member in school of psychology, and I'm also a ordained minister at the Presbyterian Church. And I'm curious to hear, how many of you have ever coded qualitative data? Okay. Oh, more than I would have thought. Awesome. It's a lot of work, isn't it? A lot of work. So with this structural topic modeling, we have the benefit of doing what's called an unsupervised learning text analysis. When we code words or responses, we look, human eyes, human minds scan for common themes. So there are inevitably biases. And so, especially in regards to when we enter waters of spirituality and religion, it's really helpful in many ways, especially when doing mathematical work, to keep biases out. So we were excited to have the opportunity to use this machine learning or AI analysis. In most typical semantic analyses that have been done until very, very recently, you need a lexicon or a text that guides the machine learning. So you might pick the Constitution, you might pick the Quran, or the Bible, or Webster's Dictionary. But with the structural topic modeling, it's actually unguided. It is completely mathematically derived, looking at spaces between words, patterns of word usages, and thousands of iterations of analysis are done to identify latent themes or underlying categories within the data. So that's the technical. So the first question that we looked at, about 7,000 responses, was the same question that Roman has been talking about. What comes to mind when you hear the word spirituality? So then in this analysis, what we found after what we do with the computer, Sung's expertise, thousands and thousands of iterations of analysis, actually came up with a bunch of different what we call topic models. If you're familiar with factor analysis, it's somewhat similar. It's from existing categories. It actually suggested a number of different models that were potentially viable. There's a ton of criteria that you examine, and then you look at some theory to figure out what makes most sense. And this 3-topic model was the one that we decided fit the criteria to fit the data the best. So looking again across the 2 years of data, these categories were named religious, which represented 34% of the samples. Key words that were identified in this process were words like God, religion, faith, close to God, pray, and we can see the rest. The second category was the smallest category, it was 23%, and we used the word Christian to describe it. The key words identified in that were peace, person, Jesus Christ, Lord, Spirit, Christ, Ghost, Jesus. More words that are more specific to the Christian tradition. The third category, which was the largest category, was named spiritual. And the key words in that category were belief, universe, connection, higher power, experience, spirituality, force, purpose, supernatural, etc. We'll unpack these a little bit for you. So in the first topic, these were actual responses that people wrote. Religious, this topic was represented by the people who used the least amount of words. They were pretty straightforward. The words in all capitals are the threats or the key words that the program identified to shape and identify this category. So people wrote things like, close to God, communication. This is pretty straightforward. The second one, these are sample quotes from folks who were identified with the second topic. Christ died for my sins, he's seated at the right hand of the Father God, now the Holy Ghost of God, etc. Very typical, traditional, conventional Christian language. And the third topic, the spiritual topic, quotes like a self-sense of being and a connection to some higher power or energy force. It's the part of us that gives us a balance between our physical presence and mental capacity. It's the part of us that makes us us. This topic was represented by the symbols that we were longest actually, which is not surprising. There was more in-depth explanation for those who identify spiritual. There's one more. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of some of the demographics that were affiliated with these topics, it's actually very complex and can't oversimplify these. But within the religious factor for more women than men, they did report higher amounts of religious and spiritual attendance. They described themselves as more religious, less spiritual. They talked about God's love, religion, they reported higher levels of God's love and guidance, and they were a little less active in their community. Whereas the Christian category was a very ethnically diverse category. It was a little bit older. They did report more religious and spiritual attendance. And they also, this is very interesting, reported being more spiritual and less religious. And I'm wondering if this might represent people who might talk about having a relationship with God and feel a close affinity to God rather than feeling religious and in Christianity. The spiritual category, again, more women, it was mostly a younger group. They reported less amounts of religious and spiritual attendance. They described themselves as less religious. They reported less amounts of feeling God's love or guidance, and they were more active in their community. Then over time, I wanted to share with you that the changes were not radical. But between 2020, pre-pandemic, and the end of 2022, end-ish of pandemic, there was actually less people represented in the religious spectrum, slightly more in the Christian category, and then there was some significant change. Okay. The second question that we looked at was only in the 2022 data, and this was actually the question that we discussed at the beginning. In what ways did your religious or spiritual life change as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic that began in March 2020? We did the same type of analysis. This time we landed with a 5-topic model, and you can see the percentages on the left of the number of participants that represented each of these different categories. And the way to summarize going to this artificial intelligence analysis, how people describe their changes in their spirituality, was the first topic was a change in values. People talked about how they were going to shift their priorities, and feeling became more important. Spirituality, God, other things became more clear with spirituality. And then the second one, actually, so this is change in priorities, topic one. Then, there we go. Change in attendance was 24% of the population. And this is not shocking. We all had to change attendance, whether school, work, religious services, or whatnot. But this was not something that we all had a lot of choice. So they said things like, we stopped attending in-person services, et cetera, et cetera. The third topic was very interesting. Described it as change of faith. And this actually reflects what people changed their faith in. Many people, when asked, how did your spirituality change? They said things like, I lost faith in government. I had more faith in science. Or, as in the second quote said, I think that seeing how poorly the politicians were handling the whole thing, I needed to rely more on my faith in believing that God was there and had a plan for all of this. So there was no clear direction in which way faith was changing, but the largest categories represented that we were shifting away from religion, or shifting towards it, away from science, or towards it, or some type of humanity towards it. So that was very interesting. The fourth one was a change in focus, and somewhat similar to change in values, but the change of focus, these individuals described, it changed how they use their time. So I needed something else to occupy my time, and I found a sense of belonging, connection, and purpose through my spirituality. It helped me learn that there are more things that matter over the push to capitalistic values in the country prioritizes over. So change of focus. And the last one, the largest category, was no change at all. And these were folks who largely reported not being spiritual or religious. So it wasn't surprising that they didn't report the change in their response of religion or spirituality. I'll just wrap it up with that those in topic one, values, topic two, change of faith, and the last topic that we did because of graphic reasons on the right, focus. Those individuals were more likely to report changes in spiritual growth. There was no significant relationship with those who reported change in attendance, which makes a lot of sense. There was a lot of choice about attending things. In spiritual growth, it was negatively associated with those who reported no change. Again, makes sense. I'll just close by saying, leaving your question, is that I'm assuming that folks that have taken the time to come to this parliament are really interested in understanding how we enable people to access spirituality and faith and religion in their life in meaningful ways. And one of the things that I've gathered from this analysis is we saw in the first model, perhaps the way people are talking about religion or spirituality has not changed tremendously. But we know through this data and others that our attitudes and behaviors are changing. And so it's interesting to realize that semantics might be slower to catch up with how people are behaving. And I think that's the challenge to spiritual and faith leaders, to come up with language that is meaningful, that gets at how spirituality is engaging them in their lives, whether it's around changing their values, changing how they spend time, changing what they do. So for me, this all was very fascinating to understand how complex spirituality is in this age. Thank you.
This is Brian Senator. Thank you so much. Okay, just to really thank you for setting up that beautiful transition as we planned this. I'm going to speak for a moment about really what we found in the data from not an AI analysis, but the quantitative data and some of the answers to new questions we asked in 2022 about their activities, people's activities during the pandemic, what helped them, what they engaged in. With this overarching question, did our spiritual wells create hope and possibility for one of the more challenging times in our life? As you saw in the presentation earlier, we talked about spiritual experiences. How many people may feel daily or frequently throughout the day thankful for their blessings, touched by the beauty of creation. One of the questions that we asked about spiritual growth highly relates to those who frequently feel grateful. So 88% of those who experience some sort of spiritual growth are feeling gratitude every day and multiple times a day. Other high measures related to spiritual growth were those popular daily spiritual experiences, feeling touched by the beauty of creation, asking for help from a higher power, and desiring to be closer to a higher power. We asked which of these, we explicitly asked, of the spiritual activities that you engaged in, which of these practices helped you endure difficulty? 73% noted prayer, 66% noted being in nature, 66% noted experiencing art of some kind. Over half of these respondents that maintained or had improved mental well-being, a different question asked about their mental well-being, had frequent activities with these same activities. We also asked which of these activities gave a sense of hope. Prayer, being in nature, art, reading, and then very interestingly, one of the practices that just kind of jumped up on the list when we asked about what gave you a sense of hope, acts of service. For those who experience spiritual growth, 70% engaged in prayer and meditation frequently. Quickly, this is a rather robust framework for studying religion. I don't know how many of you have heard of the 4 B's, but the 4 B's really kind of represent a full body religiosity, a sense of belonging, that you're a member of a religious or spiritual community, a sense of belief, you have a belief in a higher power. Behaving, your behavior and practices are according to the spiritual norms of your tradition. And bonding refers to that frequency of activity, how often you're engaged in a spiritual activity. What we found is the percentages of individuals who experience positive changes in maybe experience spiritual growth, they had improved mental well-being, felt more connected to spiritual places, had a stronger sense of meaning and purpose, a renewed sense of faith. That those people that experienced positive change in each of those areas, they met the criteria for all 4 B's versus those that did not. In other words, a full-bodied spirituality or religiosity correlates to stronger spiritual health and growth. And we measured this in several ways. All of those belonging, belief, behaving, and bonding experiences versus less than that. But also we looked at it in, for those people we measured for various life stressors. Did you lose someone during the pandemic? Did you lose your job? Did you have a job change? Did you move? And those that had significant stressors, 2 or more, you can see in terms of experiencing spiritual growth, those that have all 4 B's and yet experience 2 or more significant life stressors, experience spiritual growth at 75% versus 44% for those that did not experience all of the 4 B's or have that full-bodied spirituality. And this refers to what we saw earlier in the open-ended questions. Those that experience life challenges were able to lean in, have a deepening or shifting in values, as we heard from Pam. Activity-wise, spending more time in nature, they were more likely to be resilient and find hope during this challenging time versus those that did not. So what's next? We're going to come up with
Thank you, Gillian. Before moving on to the Q&A session, I'll make two observations. One is going back to C.S. Lewis. I believe God, suffering is God's megaphone. So he points out that resonates with our findings. He points out that when there is suffering, people go in two directions. One is rebellion, the other is deepening into religiosity and spirituality. So this is something that we have observed during the data we collected during the pandemic. Another thing is this is also consistent with Viktor Frankl. If you remember his book on Man's Search for Meaning, he talks about the prisoners in the camps. For those he could tell those who would die and check out, and others who would survive because they had a clear life. So these things are consistent. Another thing that I want to observe is what Roman talked about when people draw what spirituality means to them. When we talk about it, they use a language of religion, for example, when we talk about spirituality. James Fraser, who was at Cambridge University and is known to be the father of anthropology, the field of anthropology, particularly anthropology of religion, talked about the residual language. Even though the worldview may have changed, things may have changed, you find traces of the past religiosity in the language. So I think it was interesting to see that in the bodies and writings of the participants. So with that, we have a mic in the middle of the room. Unless you are confident that you can project wherever you are, I encourage you to come forward to the mic and ask questions of any one of us here on the panel.
Hello, hi everyone. My name's Sally, very spiritual, very religious. I want to thank you for your research, truly. My question is whether you saw or had research on increased grief practices. Was there any deep dive into how people dealt with their grief? I'm a chaplain by training, so thank you.
Unfortunately, we did not have a specific question related to that, so we didn't have any quantitative data. However, I would say that anecdotally, I didn't do it, and it didn't show up as one of the topics, so it wasn't significant in numbers. But I do anecdotally know through the open ends. We saw an earlier quote of how someone said, "This is like I lost both of the guiding lights in my life, both of my parents, and this will be a spiritual question I'll continue to delve into." So we saw it referenced in times as they were thinking about how their spiritual life changed, but that we didn't have any specific questions about how they dealt with grief practices. We may have a quantitative number, and we can look at this for you of how many noted losing someone. That's about as much as we have.
Thank you. I'm Melissa Bell, and I'm from the Bay Area, for health center. And what brings me to the mic today is just thinking about our relationship to nature and how that shapes our sense of where we go for goal, for inspiration. I remember when I first started seminary, I asked many peers, where did they find God? And 97% were in nature, even though they were studying to be ordained. So I thought that was really interesting. It wasn't in church, it wasn't. So I'm just wondering, could you elaborate just a little bit about what you learned, particularly with the climate crisis coming on? How do we find our way in nature, and also what thoughts you might have about the desperation and loss of as we're losing environmental degradation, as we're having environmental degradation, what does that mean for our sense of spirituality?
As you see here, and I noted it, and it's probably what brought you to the mic too, we, compared from the 2022 to the 2020 data, a definite increase in being in nature for spiritual practice. And, in some sense, it's quite obvious. We were all home. We were able to spend more time in either isolation or with our family in nature. And it showed up not only in the question of how did your spiritual life change, as they described being in nature more, but I would say, we saw it somewhat in those drawings of how nature was depicted in their spiritual lives. One other question that we don't have the data right here to show you, but we asked a question, was among those measures of how did your spiritual life grow, was a measure asking about being connected. Did your deepening with places of a sacred nature, did it deepen? And we saw an increase in those for those, again, who had a full-bodied spiritual life, that being in sacred places increased and was important. So all I can say is to, your larger question is that we hope data like this and the question continuing to ask, what does spiritual health mean to you, that those questions of nature and being in nature are among those answers, and are just delved into more to continue to create a sacred sense of what the natural world is to us. So continue the thought with what you're doing.
I'll also say that sociology, religion, nature is something that's a common finding, that is a connection for people and spiritual practices. And something I said earlier, and something Mohammed said earlier about the other work that I do using photography to bring people together to have conversations. Oftentimes when we bring people together that are from different religious traditions, they'll show up with a picture to that conversation of something that surprises other people at the table. Oftentimes that's nature. You'll have I remember this Muslim woman that brought a picture of some flowers to a meeting and started talking about them. And the Christian woman across the table kind of went, duh, of course you see Allah in the sunset, because I see God in the sunset too. And I think that there's a piece to this that goes back to that, what I said about a picture being worth 1,000 words, only if we talk about it. Like there's this disconnect. We don't really realize oftentimes that there's these shared sensibilities. We see the contours of them from a study like this, but it's in that everyday practice of connecting with other people, of being open to saying, hey, here's one way that I really connect, and finding out that someone else connects that way can lead to collaboration and solidarity around really important issues like climate crisis.
I would add to that, you're probably aware that there is a movement that goes back to the 60s, even before, of a spiritual kind, and most recently, you are probably aware that the Pope Francis wrote the Laudato Si, that sort of also inspired other religious traditions to respond. So there's a movement, of course, in that direction. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
This question is mine. You didn't want to answer that. I was just wondering if being sober and steely-eyed researchers, as we went into the work that you did, what was maybe just briefly something in your work that you said, wow, this is really surprising to me. I did not see this one. Would there be time to just maybe a sense about things that really surprised you as you were into it?
I think I kind of shared about that already when I talked about how when we asked people to draw spirituality, they didn't really draw spirituality. They drew a lot about religion, which was a little bit of a surprise. And, in my own nerdy little world of methodology, it raises some interesting questions about this kind of approach and the validity of the data and the strength of the data and the kinds of things you can learn from these types of experimental results.
I would also say the first model that I showed you, the 3 factors of religious, Christian, and spiritual, or spirituality, I thought there were many more factors that actually have less conventional religious words. And so to realize, like, wow, people really often fall back on traditional words and language, but I don't always know that that's their experience or what's connecting with them most at the deepest level. So that was
It wasn't a surprise. I just want to say and reiterate how our hypothesis going in that, as I've said, a full-bodied spiritual life leads to resiliency and hope, and how much that was proven in the data. It wasn't a surprise. It was just wonderful to see that, in fact, when we live out a spiritual life beyond just our identity, but in our practice and the benefits we see for daily spiritual experiences, that is in fact what builds resiliency and hope for ourselves. So it was a wonderful and not surprise, a wonderful finding.
Anyway, I was wondering, one of the purposes of Fetzer is to study spirituality and how it might animate concrete and positive change. So how do you feel that this study might animate concrete and positive change?
Well, the study is sort of a baseline telling us where we are as a society and also as individuals. And we hope that will inspire, together with other things, more positive transformation. We have endured one of the most difficult times in recent history. And as you can see in the study, spirituality helped us. People were praying a lot. So we hope that will continue in the future. And there will be more challenges too.
Thank you all for presenting today. I had a question about the individuals who were spiritual and might not have the complete knowledge of more needs because they have identity in the community. And I was curious if you had somehow extracted those or were able to study that group of people in terms of their resiliency and spiritual growth. Yeah. Not having a community to affiliate with, somebody who might from religious tradition was a factor in growth and resilience.
I think with, even though we may have those who do not identify with the tradition, there were a couple of different measures. One was around their spiritual activity. Did they engage in, we had the question of, are you a member of a spiritual or religious tradition? Do you attend religious or spiritual services? But we had another question, do you attend other spiritual groups? And I think that helps identify those that may be bonding with their tradition, even though it may be a non-traditional one. It's hard to complete, like we don't have all the factors to know exactly who these people are. And I think it's a big open question of what's missing in a full-bodied spiritual life, and what does that look like? As I said, the 4 B's framework comes from studying religion, and I know other scholars are looking at this, but I think there needs to be probably another framework that meets those that are maybe not falling within those traditional religious definitions.
One more question.
You.
I'm interested in how more people are turning to non-religious sources for spiritual passion and their spiritual needs. I was thinking on that. How has that shown up in your research? And part two is, are you going to be doing this on an ongoing basis? I'm really interested in how that shows up in resiliency over time, when it's not intention of secular organizations or groups to be meeting those needs, but people are doing it through those avenues.
As on that note, I will not say what the service going to be tracking and whatnot. But we do know from a psychological perspective, there are many benefits associated with spiritual and religious. But some of those benefits are through the communities and the connections. And so that is, to the point of the earlier discussion, easier to access in religious traditions. But sometimes those aren't always healthy communities. They might be very judgmental, they might not be as intergenerational. So I think something that those who are pursuing spirituality on an individual basis, something that they can garner from this kind of work is that when their spirituality can be practiced and shared with others, just looking at these photos, it is more powerful and more impactful. So isolated and individualized spirituality is not as fruitful as spirituality that can be shared with others and moves of the full body sense also enacted. I often think of transcendence or spirituality as not just experiencing something transcendent, but responding to it in our identity and also in our actions and how we live our lives. So in spirituality, in that full body sense, it is much more powerful than our resilience and thriving.
I'll just offer as well that in terms of the activities that we asked about, where I think we see an increase in non-traditional spiritual activities, being in other kinds of groups, as I mentioned, acts of service. These other activities kind of show up with this group, but I'll just remind you of the overwhelming majority of Americans are coming from a spiritual and religious place, and those numbers of the spiritual but not religious are rather small.
Okay, wrapping up our panel. Thank you, my fellow panelists. The report we have again for those of you who came later, we have samples of the report from 2020. We still have a few copies you can pick them up. The new reports and data will be available in September or October. We also plan to have more conversations on with different audiences on topics. So stay tuned. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you for coming.